Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Zimone and Dina, which is, in its actuality, an Aluren deck. And we'll get into Aluren very quickly, but first, this is a donation deck that comes to us from Lexa. Thank you so much, Lexa, for continuing to support the channel. They say, I've been wanting to make an Aluren deck for a long time, and there were enough interesting inclusions in OTJ, Outlaws of Thunder Junction. I see the acronym and I forget what it is. Outlaws of Thunder Junction, that I decided to finally build it. Would love some feedback on it, and here's the list. Thank you so much for sending this. I honestly really like the deck, and you know I say this sometimes, but I feel like the deck at its core is already mostly complete. I think it's a really good draft. I think I'm very impressed with a lot of it, but I do have additions. I do have a few cards I want to talk about, and I mean, what's the fun of just saying that it's great? Let's go see what makes it great, and let's talk about the commander and the secret enchantment commander. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. Alright, so before we go to see the commander, let's look at Aluren. Aluren is a 4-mana enchantment, 2 green, and it says any player may play creature cards with converted mana cost 3 or less without paying their mana cost and as though they had flash. So I'm a fan of like secret commander decks where there's another creature or another, you know, very powerful card within the deck that you can pull out and use as your commander. Now, making an enchantment over a creature does make it a bit tougher to grab, but with the inclusion of black, we do have a lot of tutors to grab it. So then looking at Aluren, this is one of those really game-changing abilities, right? We go from what was considered a normal type of gameplay into a completely different way to play Magic. All of a sudden, the majority of most players' creatures are now free and can be cast at instant speed. That does really change the gameplay and will heavily favor decks that tend to have a lot more card draw, because mana for most of their creatures is now no longer a question. That being said, it is worth considering the power level of a deck like this. Now, this deck that is submitted to us is a pretty high power level deck, I would say, and as that power level grows, Aluren becomes more of a double-edged sword, because at higher like power levels, people tend to play more low mana creatures that have a lot of utility to them. Thinking about things like, you know, Esper Sentinels, the Dockside Extortionist, I was trying to remember what that guy was called, and a lot of other really like powerful low mana creatures. What is it? My goodness, none of the names are coming to me. A lot of really good low mana creatures are now free, making it so that decks can now cheat out tons and tons of mana, and all they need is card draw. And so in stronger pods, you're going to feel this on the other end. Like, you're going to feel your opponents use this. Now, on weaker pods, I don't think this is really a card that's going to be fun to play at this power level. You need a pretty weak deck for Aluren to feel fair and not just one-sided. And if you're building around this card, it's going to be really hard to not make your deck very strong. For that being said, let's look at the actual commander of the deck and how they work together. Zimone and Dina is one of those combination of 2 legendary planeswalkers that we saw in March of the Machine, and I do really like this combination. This is a card that I'm just always impressed by, and I just don't play enough Sultai, mainly because I don't play enough blue and green to really get there, but I just think this is a really cool card. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life, which is just fine, I think, really, in Commander. The fact that it's not each opponent is kind of lame, but I will take the targeted damage. But mainly we want this for the second ability, where you sacrifice another creature, draw a card, then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, and then if you control 8 or more lands, you get to do this again. This turns your creatures into explorers, right? Yeah, into explorers, or growth spirals is probably a better way to look at it. And I think it's a really good mix of those abilities. So looking through the deck, I think mainly we're taking advantage of both the secret commander and the commander itself. At 36 lands, I won't lie, I think I wouldn't mind having 1 or 2 more lands because of how our commander works, but I think it's pretty close. We have such a nice collection. We do have fetch lands, so that will reduce the amount in your deck in a deck that wants to draw a bunch of cards and put a bunch of lands into play. There's also a bit of tension between the land ramp ability of these two and Aluren. As noted before, Aluren just basically ignores the fact that you have mana for your creatures, and this is a creature-heavy deck at 28 creatures. So, and a lot of, before I continue, a lot of our instants do have like either extraordinarily low costs or cheatable costs, such as Force of Negation, Mind Break, Trap, or Force of Will, can all be paid 0. So I think it's worth noting that these cards, you know, don't benefit from Aluren, and they don't really benefit from Zimone and Dina's ability. So that's a bit of tension that I don't think there's a solution to. I don't think you can get rid of that tension because it's just core to the deck, and I don't think it's something to worry too much over otherwise. Looking at the deck itself, I want to reiterate that I think this is a very, very good deck. It is a bit costly, I think mainly because of the lands, but I would additionally say a few cards like Beseech the Mirror, cards like all the tutors from Demonic Tutor to Vampiric Tutor. These cards aren't necessarily free, and I will actually suggest a few budget alternatives for players who want to play this deck at a cheaper cost. But otherwise, if you have the money or if you are proxying a deck, which I always suggest, this is a pretty good start. I think it has very few direct flaws and a lot of really cool, neat things. And that's the direction I'm going to kind of try to add on to, is my additions are going to be likewise kind of neat, kind of cool, and play with a few of the things the deck has in different ways. I will say a few cards that catch my eye as being a little less interesting to me would be cards such as Social Climber. Social Climber says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. I think this is a pretty bad deal for a 3-mana creature that has 3/2, and I think it's even a worse deal when you consider that, let's try to remember what this card is. Can we open a new one? Essence Warden, I believe it's called. Yes, while Essence Warden exists, I think Essence Warden is just much better, as it will trigger. This is a copy of Soul Warden, so this card will trigger whenever any of our opponents have a creature come into play, which I think is just going to be much stronger than Social Climber. Social Climber isn't a creature you're going to attack with. It is a creature you want to that wants to stay on the battlefield and therefore doesn't get sacrificed by Zimone and Dina. I'm just not too impressed, and I would say even if it was Essence Warden, I think I still wouldn't like that either. Both of these cards are cards that just want to stay on the battlefield, and your deck gets better as your creatures leave the battlefield. So both of those I'm not too interested in. Another one that I saw just a moment earlier, and let's see, Jewel Thief. Jewel Thief likewise feels particularly weak. I do understand the synergy of having a much better body at 3/3 for 3, Vigilance Trample. This is a creature that is very impressive for its mana cost and the fact that it enters on ETB, it creates a treasure token. I think that's cool, don't get me wrong, and I think there is something to note if you can like play this out on turn 3 to just ramp a little. But when are you doing that, right? You're going to play your commander over it every single time, and when you cheat this creature into play, is it really that impressive? And I would argue probably not. I think this is just okay. It's like using something like Prize Statue, if you're familiar. It's a 2-mana artifact, enters the battlefield or leaves the battlefield, you get a treasure token. However, it's a whole mana cost less, it creates a whole other treasure when interacted with. So in comparison, Jewel Thief feels particularly weak. A really nice budget card, don't get me wrong, but here at this power level, I don't think it's really what I want, by a wide margin, I would say. Most of the other ones I think is fine. Mausoleum Wanderer and Cursecatcher I think are just okay. I like that they're defensive, but they have the same kind of problem where they're not ETB-oriented creatures, and therefore, you know, they don't, you want to keep them on the battlefield. And very specifically, both of them are creatures that don't dramatically lose their abilities as the game goes on. Like, I do get the idea that both of them function as either, you know, a type of force spike or mana tithe, if you're more familiar, where you are taxing a card by probably around 1 mana for each of them in order to counter them. Now, that does get a little worse when your opponents have more and more lands, but in decks like this where you expect your opponents to be very low to the ground, where you're playing this many tutors and your opponents are probably doing the same, you do know that you want to be very, very careful with your opponent's mana, and they're going to be low to the ground, so being able to counter a specific spell or counter a counter spell gets a lot better with these 2 cards. And I do like that. I do still think to an extent that they might be traps. I will suggest, like, generally, I think I would prefer them to be like mana dorks in the 1 mana slot. We're playing a 3 mana commander, and at 3 mana commanders, we benefit a lot from like a Birds of Paradise or a Deathrite Shaman in a deck like this. If you wanted to go further with this kind of budget, I would say the Delighted Halfling would be the 3rd one I'd grab. But those are really, really good here because they enable our commander to be out on turn 2, and they have a much better relationship with our commander because they literally become redundant once you have enough mana, which means you can sacrifice them with impunity. But also, what Zimone and Dina do replaces the mana you'd be losing by sacrificing a mana dork. So I think there's a lot of really cool synergy there, and I think it's a lot more straightforwardly good. Whereas both Curse Catcher, Mausoleum Wanderer feel a little cuter. Like, I get how they're supposed to work with Aluren because they come into play when your opponents are tapped out, and they come in and they specifically target non-creature spells. So it doesn't matter that your opponents don't have to pay for their creatures because they have to pay for the instants and sorceries. However, that kind of continues that loop of thinking. We can take it further and say, well, because our opponents aren't spending many mana on their creatures, if they're holding up instants and sorceries or spending it on instants and sorceries, they'll still have like extra mana in general because they're not also casting creatures. Like, it's a loop of thinking that doesn't really have an end, and overall it makes me feel like these creatures are just a little too weak for the deck. I think especially Mausoleum Wanderer, who is much stronger, if we had a greater collection of spirits, which, looking here, we have only the singular one, maybe? And even then, I don't think I would like it. Even then, I'm going to say pretty straightforwardly, I am unimpressed by those cards, and I would cut it. I will also say, notably, where is it? I feel like Damnation should be Toxic Deluge, just because it's a superior spell, and at this power level, I like it a little more. And I might even suggest playing both, because it just doesn't hurt to have that level of power. Otherwise, I do like a lot of things. Brainstorm, Consider, Opt, altogether. I don't particularly like Brainstorm. I don't mind as much in a deck with fetch lands, but these spells I think are just a little cute. Don't get me wrong, I do understand their power with our commander because they draw us a 2nd card, allowing us to drain someone. But and Brainstorm does it all by itself, draws 3. But that being said, these are not cards I like in Commander when they don't heavily work with our game plan. Now, don't get me wrong, our game plan is drawing multiple cards, and this does trigger that. But when I say work with our game plan, I'm talking about like Magecraft commanders, or I'm talking about, you know, spell crafting commanders or spell casting commanders, like something that spell mastery maybe is the word, but like spells that work, like you want to cast a million spells like Storm and the like. Whereas here, all we're getting is an additional drain on your opponents, and we can only trigger that once per turn anyways, because it's specifically your 2nd card. Therefore, these have just become cantrips, and I really do not like cantrips in the format. Brainstorm gets a pass because of the fetches and because of the sheer number of cards it draws to immediately trigger your commander. I think that's fine, but Consider and Opt, I think they're just kind of weak. I think they're just placeholder cards in a deck that's kind of, you know, limited in space. Like, there's definitely a few other cards like Opposition Agent. That was a 3-mana card I was trying to think of at the start of the video, and I couldn't remember its name. But cards like Opposition Agent that would be really, really strong at this power level are being pushed out by cards like Consider and Opt. So I don't find that to be a very nice trade-off, and I would like to cut those cards. Looking at anything else, Lose Focus, I think should be maybe Arcane Denial. I just prefer Arcane Denial to this kind of situation. Not only does it fill your hand back up a little bit, it maybe gives you a creature that can be cast for free. It also just straight up counters as opposed to giving, you know, your opponents an option to pay. And yes, we can replicate it so that your opponents cannot pay for it, but even then, I don't think so. I think the nature of this card being just, you know, you can pay mana for it makes it really, really weak. Like, part of the thing that makes this good and better than some of the other options you might have is the fact that it hits any type of spell, but if they're casting a creature spell, they have mana up. So Lose Focus won't work as well there, whereas Arcane Denial will always counter it. Okay, that's generally the things I want to touch on. Maybe something I've been thinking about is maybe I should take a minute to kind of explain some aspects of the deck that catch my eye, but may not catch my viewers' eyes. So something I would touch on is like Aetherflux Reservoir might feel like a strange card for newer players to be in this deck. Like, we're not life gain, how are we casting so many spells? I get our spells are free. Why would we want this though? Well, I'm gonna actually add a card that does this kind of thing, but if we look at something like Cavern Harpy, we can see that Cavern Harpy on ETB returns a blue or black creature to its owner's hand. Now, there's a really great kind of combination you can do by bouncing a different creature, paying a life to return Cavern Harpy, and then casting both of them as many times as you want to spend life. And I do understand that that might be the purpose of Social Climber being in the deck, but when we get to additions, I'll just have a much more straightforward addition. Also, frankly, Cavern Harpy, I keep thinking Caravan. Cavern, my goodness. Cavern Harpy can just bounce itself indefinitely just by casting it for free with your Aluren, which will give you infinite triggers with Aetherflux Reservoir and immediately take out all your opponents. So when you keep that in mind, that makes a little more sense. I won't go through all of the other combos, but I think that one might, you know, players might need a little bit of guidance. And I get it. There's sometimes combos in here I don't get at all, so I'll try to like point them out when I can and as we go through them. All right. That's enough of that. Let's go into additions. As you may have seen earlier, I want to shout out Clutch of the Undercity and Dimir House Guard. These are both transmute cards. I want to note them because I think for budget versions of this deck or budget players, transmute is an ability that I think is really, really powerful when you're in blue-black and playing some kind of secret commander setup. Both of these cards can be transmuted into Aluren. Now, do note this is a sorcery speed effect, and it does reveal the card, so it is in a lot of ways inferior to the other options black has, but at a budget, these cards will grab you Aluren every single time. They don't really apply to this deck unless Lexa is desperate for another tutor, which I think there's still better options like Diabolic Intent. Even the Suspend Black one I think would be great here, but I just wanted to note them anyways for people who might want to build this kind of idea on a budget. Alright, so I saw the Exploit Silumgar Sorcerer that I really, really like, so I wanted to throw out one or two Exploit ones, and this is the one I wanted to throw, but I found another one. But Siditzi's Faithful is a very, very interesting creature. Is a one I really enjoyed in a ton of formats. I think this creature is deceptively good. I think the exploit of it is really, really great. I think the fact that it's basically an ETB is fantastic, and the fact that she can just exploit, or they can just exploit themselves and immediately bounce something, especially with the instant speed and free cast that Aluren provides, overall makes this into a very, very versatile package. In fact, there's a lot of situations where if you're you know, especially at higher power levels, you know, there's attacks coming turn per turn, and if you don't have a good defense setup, Sidithi's Faithful can go in there, sacrifice one of your ETB creatures, bounce something, and just be around as a 0/4 to take some blocks, and I think that's particularly good. This is also a great creature that if you return to your hand, you're going to get a lot of utility from, and in a pinch, you can use this to bounce one of your creatures back to your hand to get their ETB again. Generally, a really nice utility creature that I really like. Another one that I hadn't seen before, because if you know me, I'm not the biggest fan of the Universe Beyond cards, but Henry Wu in Geneticist. That feels wrong. Henry Wu, I haven't seen the newer Jurassic Park movies. I didn't even really like the original Jurassic Park the older I got, but this is an interesting character who I don't know is good or evil. Can't help you with any of that, but has a very interesting series of text for this deck. So it gives all other human creatures you control exploit, and then whenever a creature you control exploits a non-human creature, you draw a card. If the exploited creature has 3 power or greater, create a treasure token. Now, this makes me think they're evil, because it's very much literally humans exploiting non-humans. That's pretty racist. I know in the context of these, it's specious, but in Magic, it's definitely racist. And I think yet it is such an interesting addition or alternative commander. So something that I think is worth noting right away is Zimone and Dina are human and non-human at the same time, specifically because it's 2 creatures. Now, I don't think you'll draw a card because they are human, but Dina being the human side, Zimone being the human side, is a really nice way to trigger this creature with your commander. And through our deck itself, we have quite a kind of variation of humans and non-humans. I don't think it's going to be half and half, but actually, let's find out. Of our 28 creatures, our humans are 11, so roughly half, plus our commander, which I would say counts a little higher because of our accessibility, their accessibility to us. So that really catches my eye. I think that's a really interesting card. I also think notably it does something very, very similar to Zimone and Dina, where this card sacrifices a creature, draws you a card, and then under certain circumstances generates mana. Now, I think Zimone and Dina do it a little better in the essence of, you know, repeated value that gets better and better with time, especially with not trying to get all your creatures at 3 power. But Henry is much better with Aluren because you can just do this multiple times per turn, right? There's no once per turn clause. You don't need to tap them. You can just keep playing creatures. As long as they're humans and they're exploiting non-humans, you'll get more and more triggers. You'll draw cards, which will get you more creatures to cast. So though a Henry Wu build of this deck is a little different, I think it is still very interesting to me. I think you would have to make changes to make sure you hit that 3 power or greater, because you'll generate, and not all creatures, but enough creatures that you'll generate enough treasure tokens to make your instants castable. With that, you can protect your combo, and you're just going to churn through your deck until you assemble a combo that'll win you the game. That really catches my eye. So if I had a suggestion to increase power of the deck, I would try this version of the deck. Otherwise, I think you can still go into this version, like with Zimone and Dina. It's just a little trickier, but is still interesting. So if there's anything I want to point out as an interesting option, this is it. Going forward, I have 2 cards that really catch my eye on reusability, where we have a lot of cards that go to the graveyard, and we have a few that pull out of the graveyard, we have a few that bounce back and forth, blah, blah, blah. I wouldn't mind a little bit of recursion just to be able to replay certain cards. Because certain cards are just really, really good, have really good ETBs, and being able to buy them back, even with cost of life and mana, is offset by the fact that Aluren will pay for their mana cost. So Phyrexian Reclamation is very much so a very, very impressive card to me, and just generally very, very good. So this one in mind, I think, is very powerful and very easy to run. The other one is a little more questionable, I will take that, but is a card I have a big soft spot for. and this is Palace Siege. Now, Palace Siege is a card with 2 abilities. The dragon side is reminiscent of our commander, but don't worry, we'll never use the dragon side. We ally ourselves with the cons. And the reason we do is that at the beginning of your upkeep, you return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Now, this card might be a little too weak to the current version of the deck, but if you play a weaker version or you like this kind of effect, Palace Siege is an exceedingly powerful effect. I just thought about this with Obeka. Maybe I should have suggested that. This is a really cool card with Obeka. If you're playing Obeka upkeeps, Palace Siege is very interesting. But going back to this, beginning of your upkeep, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This is an exceedingly powerful ability that you get every turn. Now, the thing is sometimes we take recurable abilities and we compare them to the cheapest version of the card. So to this, I believe it would be Disentomb. Disentomb is 1 mana sorcery, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. And you might say, well, Curse, this is not a good card. Why would I want to play a card that has this effect each turn if the original card that it's doing is not very good? Well, there's 2 reasons that I think, these are my 2 arguments against that. The first thing is every card gets better if you recur it and if you cast it for free. Now, Disentomb feels particularly bad because it's 1 mana, so, you know, spending 1 less mana a turn to repeatedly do this doesn't feel impressive, but the repeatability of it is really, really good. Otherwise, I'm going to make an argument that's maybe a little strange, and it's that Disentomb is actually a pretty decent card. It is one of the best draw cards you can play mid to late game, and it is just very, very powerful to buy back something that you have lost in the game and immediately get it. But it is weak. So why am I saying it's strong while being weak? Well, the thing is I wouldn't suggest to anyone playing Disentomb as a card. You have 99 slots, and to use one of them on Disentomb feels particularly wrong. It feels weak, it's narrow, whereas you could play something like Ewit. We're playing old, was it Rasputin? It's not Rasputin, sorry, old Ruth. It's not Ruth. Honest Rutstein? I don't actually know. This guy will have, you know, that same kind of effect for triple the mana in 2 colors with an additional ability as a 3/2 creature. It's obviously very, very much so superior. So in real Magic, we do not play Disentomb. We play other versions of this. So this card feels weak because it's just there's better options. However, the card's effect is strong, and being able to do it every turn for free is very, very strong. I would recommend this to mid-level power mid-power decks, and occasionally like higher power decks that like want to try something fun to get that additional card back every single turn. And I think it catches up on you, the card advantage of it, very, very quickly, and it allows you to keep casting and sacrificing cards that you otherwise don't have the ability to maintain. I think of this like, you know, what is that 1 mana frog that's a fog? The fog frog? That would be a really good example of this. Or there's a Kami who does the same thing. Cards that are low mana, they sacrifice themselves, or are just being used for the ETB, getting them back every turn cycle is rather a big, you know, thorn on your opponent's side. However, if this gets counterspelled or removed, you're going to not feel very good, so there's a pretty big asterisk on this card, and I still wanted to suggest it otherwise. Speaking of more reasonable additions, Essence Flux is just very, very cleanly good in this deck. I think it's notably missing here in a deck that has such good ETBs, a card that's been reprinted because it used to be way more, if I remember correctly. I believe it was like a $6 card at once. I wonder, is there a little... No, there's no little graph that tells me the price of it, but I think it's really interesting that since it's reprint, I don't see it more. It's just a very powerful blink ability in colors that don't usually have this as easy. So Essence Flux is able to be giving blink to Sultai, which I really like. And there's so many creatures that you have that'll be really good to blink. You can use this to protect creatures, you can use this to protect your commander. Very, very strong. There might be an argument, there's a few versions of this at 2 mana that bounce enchantments, or they flicker enchantments or flicker permanents, and you can use that to protect your Aluren. I don't know how sound that is, but I think it's worth considering. At that point, I don't know if I would just play like, not cast out, is it? No, there's this counter target counter spell perm you control. There's a big picture of the moon. That's how I remember cards. Turn aside. Sometimes I remember cards of how they make me feel. Is that normal? Turn aside is a card that will counter target spell that targets a permanent you control, and maybe instead of blinking Aluren, you can just use turn aside to protect it. But once again, the utility of this card is kind of low. It's very narrow. A creature that I thought really caught my eye in terms of bouncing is Baron, Tolarian Archmage. I think Baron does a lot here. I think, first of all, not only is it just one of those ETB bounce cards, but I think it just works really well with your own strategies, where you play this, bounce your own creature out, and on your end step you'll draw a card because you've bounced your own creature. Otherwise, once again, the utility is pretty high to bounce your opponent's creatures. You can use this to, you can't bounce itself, notably, but just to rebuy an ETB is really nice. So I think this card is neat. It's a little cute, but it's definitely better than something like, I don't know, the social climber or whatever it is. This is much better. But the other one I wanted to suggest was Dreamstalker, because I think Dreamstalker is just a lot more straightforwardly good, because you can use this with itself. Like, you have Aluren, you play Dreamstalker, it bounces itself, you play Dreamstalker, it bounces itself, and you do this infinitely, and then you can use any combination of cards to take, like Aetherflux Reservoir or other forms of storm cards if you'd like to immediately defeat all your opponents. So pretty good there. But notably, this is permanent, not creature. So you can use Dreamstalker at instant speed to protect Aluren if the need applies. So I think this is, although kind of a strange and cute card, it is definitely stronger than it looks. I say cute, this is the weirdest card. I don't know what, it's an illusion, but it's a weird kind of monkey creature. It's half dead or like has some kind of disease. It's a 1/5 for some reason. It's just strange. This is a strange creature, but I think it would do a lot here. And that is all of my additions and all of my thoughts on the deck. Honestly, I think this deck is really cool. I really like the way it works, and I think, like I said before, it already is in a really good space, but there's just a few things I would change. And those little things might not make much of a difference, but I am interested in them. If nothing else, I would consider, once again, a version of this deck with Henry Wu, because honestly, it would be a really cool direction to go into this deck, and it might let you play some more Universe Beyond cards, which, you know, everyone else seems to love it, so I can't complain too much. Something I did, Invasion of Ikoria, it's kind of a tutor card. I'm not sure what it's meant to tutor every single time. I know the Archlich is very good to constantly get a bunch of triggers and then be bounced back to hand repeatedly. I don't know exactly the perfect card you're supposed to grab with it, but I do respect the fact it does a lot. I'm just probably, I said earlier that like there's some combos I miss. I might be missing the combo here, but otherwise I think it's just fine. Versus all of the other tutors you have, this seems to be the weakest one. Our other side of this card is particularly bad. I don't really like it. And blinking this card doesn't really do anything because we don't have zero cast creatures. So, a little confused with that card, but I'm sure I'll hear about it in the comments. Thank you so much, Lexa, for sending this deck. I think it's a lot of fun, and I hope to see another draft of it, because honestly, I think it's really rather rad. All right, good luck and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe. I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you and good luck in brewing and building.